for the individual to evolve, they had to purify the soul. They had to purify it from the some of the external and some of the karmic or internal configurations that we all have. Some of the complexes that we've either inherited or we've actually developed over time. So they took purification as a part of the tenets for, especially for novices, to be able to arrive at a state to do some spiritual research, spiritual investigation. And those practices have actually been continued and are part of the Miriam that enable to be able to transmit healing energy. You need to reach a level of purity, and not so much in the moral sense, but in the initiatic sense, in the sense that consciousness needs to be able to separate itself from the mundane to be able to go inside and find this realm of being that is uncontaminated from the exponents of the physical or the mundane world.
Welcome to Rebel Spirit Radio, exploring the frontiers of spirituality, consciousness, the esoteric, and humanity's sacred relationship with the living earth.
I'm your host, Nick Mather, and in this episode, I am joined by author David Pantano to discuss his book, The Hermetic Physician, The Magical Teachings of Guiliano Kremertz and the Fraternity of Miriam. David provides background on Guiliano Kremertz, the leading esoteric figure of the Italian Hermetic Tradition in the early 20th century. He discusses the therapeutic magic of the Fraternity of Miriam and its connection to the mystical Pythagorean tradition. Also, please be sure to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you use to listen to or view podcasts. Your support is truly appreciated.
David Pantano is an independent researcher, translator, historian, and writer specializing in spirituality, metaphysics, philosophy, and the initiatic practices of West and East. He is the author of The Magic Door. He joins me today to discuss The Hermetic Physician, the magical teachings of Guiliano Kremertz and the Fraternity of Miriam, a compilation of essays he collected and translated. David, welcome to Rebel Spirit Radio.
Thank you, Nick, and good afternoon to, and depending on your time zone, to all the listeners and viewers across this fair land and fair lands all over, wherever you may be listening or watching this podcast. It's nice to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I'm looking forward to speaking with you because, quite honestly, I didn't know anything at all about Guiliano Kremertz, and I know I'm probably slaughtering the name, and you even told me how to pronounce it, Kremertz. And the other figure here is Marco Daffy. These are the two people that feature in your book. And I thought that the best place to begin this conversation was to ask you to discuss them a little bit. Who were they, and what were their roles in this Italic Hermetic tradition?
Okay, sure, I'd be happy to, Nick. So basically, Kremertz is without a doubt, the leading hermeticist, esoteric figure in Italy in the last century. The equivalent would be similar to like a Crowley in the English-speaking world. So he's and for people who may be familiar with some aspects of the Italian Hermetic tradition through, say, Julius Evola, who's a very well-known author now, even in English-speaking world. It's something that Evola would look up to and would reference in terms of his books. They're either the Ur group monographs or the book he did on the Hermetic tradition, or a number of books he quotes, and he refers to Kremertz's magisterium of writings and practices. So we're talking at somebody who's both a theorist and a practitioner of hermetics, and the branch of hermeticism that Kremertz is probably best known for is in the area of therapeutics, is to apply these hidden laws or occult laws into practices of healing in terms of either relieving of pain or curing altogether. So Kremertz developed or founded a circle called the Therapeutic Magical Fraternity of Miriam around the turn of the last century, so the late 1890s. And they had various chapters throughout the major cities of Italy. And it's basically, it was a hierarchy of 5 degrees, and the school, there was a school attached to it where they studied the practices of hermeticism, and not just restricted to medicine or therapeutics, but to the broad application of the various other branches of hermeticism, such as alchemy and theurgy, magic, astrology, etc. And so Kremertz founded this school called the Miriam, based on the application of natural and divine magic. So magic that founded on natural forces and those that went beyond the natural into the metaphysical realm. And so in terms of his importance, as I mentioned, Kremertz wrote around 20 books that laid out a pretty sophisticated and detailed theory and practicum of applied magic, specifically to therapeutics. And one of his disciples was a baron named Richard Ricciardelli, and who went under the pseudonym of Marco Daffy. And Kremertz, I guess the tombstone information, he was born in 1861, died 1930, and Daffy was born in 1900 and died in 1969. And sort of Daffy kind of continued that wave of alchemical hermetic practices, and wrote a number of books, about a dozen or so books on aspects such as alchemical hermeticism, on therapeutics as well, on eros, on avatars and reincarnation, on various aspects of divination using instruments such as the tarot or the Chinese Book of Changes, the I Ching. So they were both embedded within a practice that had its roots in this Italic branch of Hermeticism. So when I say Italic, I mean both the Italian and the Roman period. And there were various, I guess, Iseums or temples of Isis in ancient Rome. And with that, there were some practices, specifically with healings in terms of dream healing and other types of medications using energies and using tapping into various altered states of consciousness to be able to get out to the causal, or to get to the karmic level of individuals. So to address or root out some of the causal or basic root issues that may be afflicting individuals. So in a nutshell, in the the Cole's Notes version, it's basically the leading hermeticists of the day in Italy who founded a school to study and practice hermeticism with an outlet that focused on healing, on therapeutics. And from that, there was a number of publications, books, articles, rituals that are part of this tradition that Kremertz was a founder of, and it's under the rubric of the Fraternity of Miriam.
Okay, wonderful. A lot of information there, and some of it I would like to unpack. But first, I'm familiar with Jules Evola. That's a name that rings a bell, but I'd never heard of Kremertz before. Are his works readily available, or isn't it that the Hermetic Physician is one of the very first English translations of his works?
Yeah, actually the Hermetic Physician is the first bio on Kremertz in the English language. Kremertz work, because the Miriam is a reserved initiatic circle. It wasn't open. It didn't advertise in newspapers. It's not like some of these Rosicrucian orders that advertise at your local corner and so forth and try to recruit members. It wasn't like that. It was very much a reserved, and they wanted to weed out those serious seekers versus those who were curious or didn't have the right constitution to go and do some of this inner work. So for many years, for many decades, the material was known just to a few connoisseurs of esotericism and those individuals interested in the Hermetic branch of esotericism. I would say around the 80s and 90s, that his work started to get more prominence as some of the leading publishers across Europe, not only in Italy, but in France and in Spain, started translating and publishing his work because of the quality of the material, the theorems that you really couldn't find elsewhere. The Hermetic practices that the Miriam is based on is more on the Greco-Egyptian Roman type of practices rather than, say, the Judeo one that's, say, is more associated with the Golden Dawn and so forth. So these practices probably have a very strong and deep Western root to them, are gaining more favors as individuals are looking for, information on the roots of a Western esoteric tradition rather than going to the East, whether it's in, from Israel or India or China or Tibet or whatever. And the Kremertz and this lineage of teachings, I think, fits into that category of a autonomous Western initiatic tradition that has its roots in Egypt, Greece, and Rome, and also was transplanted into the Renaissance. The Hermetic books of Hermes, the Corpus Hermeticum, was lost in the Western world for about a millennium and a half, and they were founded around the 1440s by a Italian monk who brought them back to Florence. And the patron of Florence at that time, Cosimo de' Medici, had the leading Neoplatonic scholar named Marsilio Ficino to translate them. From then, there was this huge boom of Hermeticism. And this tradition of Italic or Italian-based Hermeticism that really was relaunched with the discovery and a translation of these ancient Greek corpus of Hermetic books into Latin and then into the vernacular has gone on for about 500 years. And Kremertz was the latest of the epigons of this tradition. And you mentioned Julius Evola in the late 20s, who founded a circle called the Your Group, and some of the members were from Kremertz's Circle of Miriam, and they were contributors in those 3 volumes that are published by Inner Traditions, the publishing house that publishes the book that I put together, Hermetic Physician.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for all of that. I was curious to kind of focus on this Italic tradition a little bit, that it seems like one of the major themes as well, and we'll get into the healing aspects, and this surprised me a little bit, was kind of a focus on Pythagoreanism or Pythagoras, the teachings of Pythagoras. And I never actually kind of connected Pythagoras with any kind of Hermeticism.
Yeah, well, so a little background on Pythagoras. Pythagoras was a mystic as well as a scientist. So there are 2 components to Pythagoreanism. There's the rational that follows. I mean, the Pythagoras, or is alleged, because there is no actual writings from Pythagoras, right, but there are from his disciples and from members of the school, was the first to promote the root of reality as being in numbers. So mathematical theorems like the Tetractys have its roots in the Pythagorean school and the discovery of the irrational number. So a lot of the mathematical theorems that came down from Greece were originated from this Pythagorean school. But there was also another side of Pythagoras, is a mystic side, and that apparently before he founded, and Pythagoras founded this school in actual southern Italy. People may not be aware of that. So there is this tradition in southern Italy of this Pythagoreanism that has both a scientific or mathematical component as well as a mystical component. And some of the tenets of Pythagoreanism is reincarnation, is the pursuit of self-discovery, that going inside yourself to find yourself, and not just solely basing your information on inputs from the 5 external senses. There's various practices or rituals they did in terms of, for novices, had to go through a 5-year period of silence, which was a part of purification, that for the individual to evolve, they had to purify the soul. They had to purify it from some of the external and some of the karmic or internal configurations that we all have, some of the complexes that we've either inherited or we've actually developed over time. So they took purification as a part of the tenets, for especially for novices, to be able to arrive at a state to do some spiritual research, spiritual investigation. And those practices have actually been continued and are part of the Miriam, that enable to be able to transmit healing energy. You need to reach a level of purity, and not so much in the moral sense, but in the initiatic sense, in the sense that consciousness needs to be able to separate itself from the mundane, to be able to go inside and find this realm of being that is uncontaminated from the exponents of the physical or the mundane world. And again, I'll leave it to you, Nick, how far you want to delve into that. But so I just wanted to answer your question that Pythagoreanism that took mysticism and gave it a scientific coding is the basis of this Italic tradition. So it's a key foundation of the Italic initiatic tradition. As part of internal investigation is that you have to have experiential proof or validity to the theorems, and not just take it on what the teacher or what the master prescribes.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for all of that. I knew about the mystical aspects of Pythagoras and that it was initiatory as well. It was noted, I think in one of the footnotes in the book, there was comments about the teachings of arete, which is excellence or virtue, and what you had just said, the sort of integration of the esoteric and the scientific. And this is the point I was really thinking about in terms of Kremertz, because it seems like there was this connection of human evolution, attempting to become more excellent humans. Is that correct? Am I on the right track there?
Yeah, I mean, that's one way to frame it. The other is that as beings, we all have a sense of perfection at the core, and that the more we extenuate out and get caught up into the workings of the world, we become contaminated. So by doing these purificatory acts, we're able to get to that level of perfection, which is the root of who we are. And that root of who we are has a name. It's called the Numen. It's the core of consciousness, of individual consciousness. And in this teaching and in Pythagorean teaching, it doesn't die. It isn't perishable like the historical self, the self of the flesh and bones, the self that gets up, Monday to Friday and goes to work every day. That spark of consciousness, the Numen, is itself perfect in its own right.
Okay. And I also noted in one of the essays, it discusses that there is no matter spirit dualism, that everything comes from the one. And I really liked in one of the essays, it said the spirit materializes and matter is spiritualized.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the teachings, is that there is a unity, or there isn't this division between the various levels of energy. It's all one energy. The various vibrational frequencies associated, and that's all part of the Kremertzian, or the Hermetic worldview of realities broken down into 4 major components. And the terminology that they use based on mythological classifications is a physical world or Hylic world, which is what the Greeks called. They call it Saturnian.
Mhm.
And then what's sublimated from that Saturnian or that physical world is a lunar. And the lunar is basically a more higher vibrational frequency than the physical, but it's still on the physical level. And that's we associate with our emotions, with the humoric level of individuals or of beings. And then a further sublimated energetic component is the mercurial, that of intelligence. And then the highest is what we talked about is the Newman is at the solar level. And that's that core being that we want to experience where the Miriam, which Miriam is a new euphemism for not only for the in religious terms and especially in the West of the Maria of the mother of God who gives birth to the divine, but it's a state of purity. It's a state that can be realized through these purification acts to be able to come to the principle of our being. And that's all one energy. It just has various vibrational components or frequencies that constitute reality. And that most people are most people's center of consciousness is at that physical level through their external senses. And that's the only level of reality that they're aware of. And other than when they have to use their noggin to come up with some, to come up with some idea or a way out of a problem or something like that, or they have an emotional, reaction and so forth. But a lot of times it's not integrated. We fragment into these various subsections of this one energy. Well, what the Miriam teaches you is that it's all interconnected. Within each cell, within consciousness itself. It's all, we have access to those four different realms. And from that, we're able to be able to shift our focus or consciousness into higher levels or levels where the laws of gravity, for example, are there are greater opportunities or potentiality for freedom. So at the say at the lunar level, in terms of dreams or ecstasies and so forth, the laws in terms of what constitutes the gravity or the frequency of the vibration is much less than at a Hylic level or at the physical level. And the same with intelligence. And then those who are able to reach sort of that pinnacle, which that solar level, are access to the past, present, and the future all at once. The laws of the mechanics of that realm of energy, of forces, is much freer, much greater than the ones down on at the mundane level. So yeah, to your point, it's all considered as one, even though we can experience various levels of consciousness or various levels of vibrational frequencies, which are called in the terminology of this school as the four that I mentioned.
Right. So it's like an ascent then, is that correct? And that ascent to the solar, because what
Yeah,
I'm thinking,
I wouldn't use, I mean, a lot of times those words are used figuratively. I mean, when we're talking here, we're already at the liminal level where the words that we have, conversational words, do not match the experiences we're trying to describe. So a lot of times we say talk about a sense, we're thinking of, some sort of escape or some sort of, elevation of the spirit or something. It can be like that, and most times it's not. And most times it's just it's all interconnected. And Kremertz says that all four of these hermetic bodies, so these various states are called hermetic bodies, are experienced at once. We just don't realize it, depending on the individual's initiatic level. They're mostly centered in one level or the other, but the initiate, the adept, can experience all of them at once because it's all unified. So I try to avoid to use words like ascent. It can be, you can have those aha moments where you break through the quotidian and you're in this, and there's this nirvanic state of bliss and illumination, but that is also can be experienced, the sense of that solar, once you're at that level where it's all interconnected and there isn't a division. The consciousness is just once, is just one. It's just that focusing it at different levels will give you different purviews of what of inputs, what you're going to see, of what you're going to experience.
Okay, so instead of thinking in terms of ascent, it's probably better to think in terms of like a holism, that, or holistic, that it's like you said, that it's all at once, that we experience them all at the same time.
Or it can be drawn upon. You have access to it all
Okay.
at once. Yeah.
Okay.
So the ability to one who is integrated to their principle is that's their starting point. Most
Okay.
people's starting point is their historic self. It's Nick and Dave, and you know that we relate to reality based on our historical reference points. The initiate or the adept, they're basing it from their Newman, from that point of consciousness, which isn't contaminated by the physical, but yet can emanate out to the physical.
Okay. And how do these four bodies play in the Hermetic healing?
Okay, good. So it plays into Hermetic healing in a number of aspects. Probably the two most prominent are in terms of diagnosis and in terms of therapy. So to be able to understand the depth or the level of the pathology that you're dealing with, so much like a doctor would do a diagnosis, you would understand in terms of if an individual comes to the Miriam for healing, certain diagnoses, I guess for lack of a better word, are undertaken to understand the depth and the significance of the disturbance that they're dealing with. So it could be something of the emotional level, which means that the prescription, the rituals, or the energy that needed to be transferred would be focused from that realm more so than in a physical realm, or it could be at a karmic level. You know, these are disturbances that are so deep ingrained that any type of physical or emotional or mercurial type of theories would only be able to scratch the surface. And the amount of reconfiguring at that level to be able to readjust the disturbance that's causing the symptoms, which is a lot of times is what's being communicated from the patient to the Miriam, is the symptoms. I'm having headaches, or I'm having problems with family members or something like that. One part of the diagnosis is to get down and at the causal level to understand what's really, at what level is the disturbance originating from, and from then they could from once they're able to diagnose what the degree of the disturbance and the level of the hermetic body that's mostly involved, then the next step is to prescribe the appropriate remedy or solution.
Okay. And the remedies and solutions here, the main thing I got out of this was that it was a kind of remote prayer where you had a group of, I guess, initiates that would focus is energy or vibration on the healing. Am I on the right path there?
Yeah, somewhat. So it's more than that. So the Miriam and Kremertz was, he not only was a practitioner who based his work on experience, he did many years of schooling in some of the occult schools in France, specifically in southern France, but he also had a degree in conventional medicine as well. And as part of the tenets of the Miriam was that this energetic healing or remote healing of the Miriam was to complement conventional medicine. It didn't come as a panacea to solve all problems. And Daffy, the disciple and the author of the book, says, you know, it's mostly for the venial type of disturbances or illnesses. Venial being those that are of a medium level. The ones that were much more serious than there were much other type of prescriptions that would be required. The Miriam is more of a lunar based um, uh, hermetic circle and rather than a solar. And so what that means is that they receive energy. So most of the energy that they work from is based on magnetism, the interconnection between celestial, terrestrial, and human energy. It's all a continuum. The history of that goes back hundreds of years to Franz Anton Mesmer, a Swiss magnetist, and the French were very strong in that as well. So Kremertz kind of continued that form of healing using magnetism. Where he added elements is adding various types of rituals and another type of means to reach that level of purity that would be greater conductive to restore the balance to the afflicted individual. In the end, there were three types or three modalities of healing. One is a direct, where the type of illness was described and diagnosed, and the type of energy would act directly on what was the disturbance. So someone's having some emotional issues, so the type of practice involved would be to transmit energy that would lead to a homeostasis of someone's emotional state of being. So some like you listen to music, and so you're feeling crappy and you listen to music and it raises your spirits up, and by the end of the song or the album, you're feeling much better. Working on that type of energy exchange. So that's a direct type of healing modality. The other type is the indirect, that would focus on instruments to assist the individual. And this could be some things that are more focused on, say, on physical ailments. So where energy would be focused on, say, vegetatives or other types of objects that could be the potent power of the actual intervention would be enhanced through this exchange of energy. The third type would be a neutral that was not only directly healing and indirect, but combined both. And again, a lot of times the appropriate prescription depended on the ability to diagnose the clarity of the symptoms to understand what is underlying the imbalance of the individual. In the end, because this is a lunar type of practice, it works on the individual receiving this energy, healing themselves. So very much on a homeostasis. So when individuals are sick, their balance, their natural healthy balance is out of whack.
Right.
And how this energy helps is to finding the right sympathies to be able to negate or to nullify some of those negative energies with a positive energy, and to lead to a homeostasis where over time the individual can heal themselves.
Okay. These energies are also the energies of the cosmos. Is that right?
So, I mean, energy is all one, so we talked about earlier.
Right.
So
Okay.
whether we call it cosmos or whether we call it metaphysics, where we call it natural, it's all one. It has just various levels of
Right.
of
Okay.
of electrodynamics associated with it. So the Miriam, based on some of the rituals, to be able to tap into a level of purity and the type of energy, depending on what was required to balance the imbalance of the patient, would tap into various type of, if you want to use the word, cosmological or astronomical type of energies based on certain configurations of astrological dimensions. So for example, we know the 4 seasons, 4 different energies associated. In wintertime, cold and dry; summertime, hot and dry, and then so on. So understanding the properties associated with the calendar and the various energies that are accentuated based on the time, based on the astrological or astronomical powers and virtues that are potentially can be tapped into those. So there is quite a sophisticated analysis based on the harmonization of the microcosm with the macrocosm, the microcosm being the individual, their state of being, with the greater macrocosm of the cosmos, of the universe.
Okay. And would the healing rituals then also take place? Because this is according to the, because one of the things that I noticed in the book is there was a focus on the days of the week, and I also think the planetary hours. And so to affect a healing, would that then be like, oh, well, if this person is suffering from this, we have to do this ritual on Wednesday during the hour that, Mercury is, Mercury's hour or something like that. Is that the way it would
Yeah,
take?
I mean the logos
Yeah.
that you're trying to form here is what we're talking about. The difference though is this is something that just wasn't made up on the fly. This
Right.
has a tradition and legacy going
Right.
back to Paracelsus and going back to the books of Hermes himself, where they actually talk about various aspects and virtues that are accentuated at their various times of the year based on the calendars, so ancient Egyptian, ancient Chaldean calendars as well. So as and the people who are familiar with us and they say, well, this is a bunch of hokey, is that again, as the example I talked about before, the energies that you're experiencing. I'm here in Toronto now, in mid-July, in July is different than the energies, the climate, the effects that we have in mid-January in Toronto. Huge difference.
Mm-hmm.
And so what does that mean? In July, people are more affected with swelling. They're more affected to get issues with the skin. In the wintertime, it's a drier, it's colder. So you may have more issues in terms of other factors. And in the spring with the humidity, you may have issues with rheumatism and arthritis. So it's looking at these calendars that go back thousands of years and the various properties and virtues associated with the various meteorological configurations that's been recorded and practiced. And it's understanding what are the virtuous or the remedying energies to balance out unbalanced energies of the afflicted individual is what we're looking at here. So it's not so much, if I tap into, Aries, I'm going to get, something like a ram or something, energies associated with stubbornness or with persistence and so forth. It's much more sophisticated in that there are manuals that look at the healing properties based on various aspects of the time of the year and the various hours of the year. And to give you an example, is that the dreams that you have, say at some of the transitional points in the time of the day, say around Vespers, around this time, around 5:30, are much different than the dreams that you have, say around 3 o'clock in the morning. Much more prone for lucid dreamings around the hours of Vesper. So when Venus comes out in the morning, just an hour before sunrise and an hour before sunset as well. Those transitionary times are much more prone or much more favorable for lucid dreaming. So the ancient scribes and scholars and doctors and they were made notes of these practices and they categorized them and they were contained within books that weren't shared with everyone because they were shared with those who were specialized in this type of occult healing or occult therapeutics.
Okay. And if I understand correctly, Kremertz wanted this healing to be available to people for free. He
Yes.
never wanted to charge. Now, was this open only to initiates, or would anyone be able to seek this kind of healing?
It was to anyone, and it was so the practices, the Miriam, the one of the, I guess, the drivers for Kremertz to start the Miriam was that at the time that in the late 1800s in Europe, they were afflicted by cholera pandemics, and people were dying left and right. So not too dissimilar to the pandemic that we just came out of a couple of years ago. And so he, instead he wanted to focus on developing psychic practices, individual or cult powers for good causes, and not just for to inflate the ego or to have power over other individuals and so forth. He wanted to use it to help people, basically help himself, help his family. So the onus was on therapeutics, even though these practices and these laws, once they're learned of how to develop and how to cultivate these occult faculties and inner powers, are available for other applications besides healing. Kremertz decided that to put this Miriam into use as a confraternity to heal people where conventional medicine had given up hope.
Mm.
And so it was done free of charge. But the one clause was that the individual had to come and ask the members of the Miriam for help. There had to be a harmony, had to be a sympathy between the practitioner and the recipient. Because if they came in and they were skeptical, if they had the wrong attitude, then that harmonic transference would be difficult to connect, in which case the Miriam couldn't help much. So there needed to be a sympathetic bond between the recipient and the practitioner. So the money wasn't part of the deal. It wasn't Kremertz didn't prohibit initiates in the Miriam not to use these powers and these knowledge for other purposes. And one of the aspects that Marco Daffy used was using these hermetic practices of purification to come up with numbers for lotteries and so forth. And apparently he was quite successful. And Kremertz was as well. The latter part of his life he lived in Monaco, where he basically lived off the fortunes of his winnings from the various games of chance that were played at the casinos of Monaco.
Okay. Oh, that's a good use of of
But
that
again, he
knowledge.
didn't.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
actually wrote a book on it under a
Yeah.
pseudonym. That, anyways. So, but it wasn't something he wanted to promote because
Right.
people would focus on that and they wouldn't
Yeah.
focus on
Right.
and the people would develop themselves as these miracle makers and
Right.
and then the whole ethos behind what the Miriam is, this level of purity would be lost, it would be contaminated. And so that the focus was on therapeutics, because it did help both the recipient and the practitioner, because it put a constraint on the growth and the inflation of the ego of the practitioner. If they were focused, that their energy to necessitate to transfer energy to help the individual not to give up, it led to opening up, to overcoming their selfish constraints to much more philanthropic and much more humanistic values than what they would otherwise normally would be focusing on.
It seems as if there is a collective aspect to all of this, that it's not just about individual healing, but it's about collective healing as well. And also, I noted there seems to be something karmic at play as well, in terms of, and I think, and excuse me if I'm incorrect, I think this is something that you were writing about in one of the essays, where it was noted about wars, for example, and the amount of pain and misery that's generated in wars, that ends up getting manifested in various illnesses. And, the note was, what would we have to say after the Second World War? Because Kremertz died before the Second World War. And am I on the right track with that?
No, you are
Because
definitely.
Yeah.
So the concept behind the quantity, not only the quality of energy. We talked about the quality of energy is that individuals, practitioners of the Miriam, initiates, they do various daily rituals and fastings to be able to purify themselves. So they're no longer centered on this humanimal being, that they go inside and discover this core being that's not contaminated by the mundane world. That's the quality of it. And every individual has the potential to realize their Miriam, is that level of purity that gives birth to the Christ, that gives birth to the God. But there's also a quantitative aspect. The quantitative aspect is that this energy that once each individual members are able to tap into, if it can be harnessed, it can be focalized, just like a laser, then the power of collective energy is that much greater than individual. So, and that's where, so Kremertz referred to a contemporary school that was based in the States called Christian Science, that followed a similar type of modality to help, and they had quite success with that as well. I think there are even still schools around now of Christian Science and so forth. So it was based on that premise that if energy is one, it can be tapped into. If it can be collected from a group of practitioners and then focused on the afflicted individual, the benefits to the individual will be that much greater than if it would be individual, than from one individual practitioner. And Kremertz would put that into practice, into trials. When he would go to his various academies, he would have individuals come forth and have them in a very simple exercise to prove the theorem, is to hold their hand up in the air, like, at 45 degrees, and see how long individually they could do it. Maybe most people do it 4 minutes. And then they would, wait a spell, and then they would do the same practice, but this time they would have members, like higher degree members, to do the ritual, to concentrate that energy and have the individual hold out their hand, and they could hold it out the hand for like 20 minutes, 5, 6, 7, 8 times as potent as when they did it by the energy by themselves. So this was to prove, and this was talked about earlier about the Pythagorean component of validating each of these theorems and not just taking it because of what the Hierophant or what the Magus says this is how it's supposed to work, is it has to be experienced and proved before it's put into practice. So that's the basis behind that theory. And then you talked about, if I recall correctly, the second part about Kremertz talks about, or actually an anecdotal situation where Kremertz was talking about, I think in general, about collective energies, and not only individual energies that have disturbances, but collective energies. And he talked about his experience in the First World War, the amount of suffering that was unprecedented, that it led to a lot of the convulsions of the 20s and 30s. Example, obviously, is the Bolshevik Revolution and Nazism and fascism coming to fore. And Daffy writes about, imagine what he would say if he experienced a Second World War with the atomic bomb, is that the imbalance from the amount of collective suffering is felt collectively. It may go latent for decades, but it'll rise up because this whole cosmic energy, the whole structure of balance has been upset. And it's almost like a cloud. I mean, here in northeast part of North America, where we're under these forest fires, where these clouds are coming over, invading cities. You've seen New York; it's like it's London or something. There's like fog. It's a similar type of thing with suffering, with this release of pain. Pain is a disequilibrium. It's an imbalance, and that in the psychic world spreads like like vapor spread in our skies, and it settles down. When it settles down and it takes root, it has an effect on the collective psyche and the collective soul.
Yeah.
So that's my understanding of that concept that Kremertz was trying to expound in one of his conversations, I think, with Marco Daffy himself.
Okay. Yeah, I just found it very interesting because one of the things that I'm constantly thinking about and promoting is that we have to have individual healing and collective healing kind of simultaneously, because
Yeah,
there's
I mean, Kremertz is way ahead of his time in some of these things about having like these hermetic clinics available in throughout cities. And, now we talk about psychotherapy and self-healing and our but we're talking about 1890s
right.
and, collective healing. And, Jung and Freud hadn't even come up with the topics of like the subconscious and the unconscious hadn't even been fully articulated by then. So he was way ahead of his time. The work that they did in the schools and the various academies was far ahead of its time in terms of understanding the connections between the various levels of being, and that required various levels of healings or therapies to arrive at that balance.
Yeah, and one, it still seems rather ahead of his time in terms of the mind-body relationship and the
Yeah.
connection between that and healing and illness.
And what's the last part you said?
And illness
Oh, an
itself.
illness, yes. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, it's only been in the last few decades that, that whole body mind healing component is starting to catch, before it was considered, a hippie domain or a fringe theory, or but now it's just starting to make so much of our physical illnesses are cause of stress, and stress is caused most part by psychological issues, a good part,
Right.
and mental healing and mental unbalances is so widespread these days that we better start focusing on it, or else society is just going to go further down into chaos, because there's a lack of stability, lack of equilibrium as a starting point for individuals. So civilization is being broken down because individuals can't cope with the stress of modern society.
Right. We need now. Did the was it the fraternity or the Brotherhood of Miriam? I think both those terms were used, right?
Yeah, they're
Uh,
synonymous. Yeah.
okay. How long? Let me ask you that. I know we're starting to run out of time. How long were they in operation?
So the Miriam was founded in the mid 1890s under Kremertz. Kremertz died in the 1930s. 1930. When he died, there was a schism. There was a number of different he had various circles called academies throughout Italy. And then some, as is inevitable in initiatic type of circles or reserved type of organizations, there was a number of pretenders who claimed they were the Miriam. So it went sort of underground. Also, fascism in Italy at that time looked down on any type of secret societies. They felt it was a branch of Freemasonry, which were internationalists and all that type of thing. So it went underground for a few decades. It surfaced after the war, but again, there was a lot of schisms in terms of various pretenders. There wasn't a unifying structure to the Miriam. And one of the last tenets that Kremertz said before he died is that, when he passes, that the one wish that he has for all Miriamites, for all members of the Miriam, is that they stay united and that they don't fragment into various sects. Well, unfortunately, that's exactly what happens. And to this day, there is a number of different sects who use the name Miriam with the I or with a Y. Some call themselves a Kremertzian Academy. Some have other type of names that suggest that they're following Kremertz teachings. But, for the most part, there isn't one body that can call itself a true inheritors of Kremertz practice. And even under Kremertz time, it was very much under evolution. It wasn't like a very static circle of practitioners. They're very much into experimentation. And again, because of that Pythagorean component, is to validate their theorems based on the success or not of putting it into practice in into real existential terms.
Okay. And you mentioned that like Evola, I think, was favorable to the teachings of Kremertz. And I thought it was really interesting and important to note that Kremertz did not like fascism. And I know that Evola, I once read that he tried to out fascist the fascists.
Yeah. I mean, they're two different natures
Sure.
altogether. If you
Sure.
read Evola's book, his nature is very much a kshatriya, of a warrior type of ethic, whereas Kremertz is more of a hermeticist,
Right.
right?
Right.
So
Right.
they're coming from two different angles, but there obviously was mutual respect, because one of the leading members of Kremertz school, who went under the pseudonym Abraxas, wrote in Evola's Your Group volumes, wrote a number of articles, probably after Evola himself had the most contribution. So there was a mutual respect, but the focus was on two different aspects of being. One was on, as Evola focuses on self transcendence,
Mm.
very much a practice of on the warrior, on self initiation. We talked about the absolute individual, whereas Kremertz was much more on the traditional hermeticism, is that you follow the Isis, Osiris, Horus type of evolution or development. But there were mutual respect, and I think even Evola even applied to one of the Miriam circles in Rome in the 1920s. But I mean, there was, again, they're two different, they're two different stars in the universe, put it that
Sure.
way.
Yeah. Well, the reason I mentioned it was because I know that the works of Evola are still on publication. And like I said at the very beginning, I was familiar with his name, but not Kremertz.
Yeah.
And I was just curious if you think that now that, with your book and some of the other writings that are becoming a little bit more available, do you think that Kremertz will become more influential?
I would think so, because I do think he's scratched out a niche all of its own. Again, most of the Western-based esoteric schools are following the Kabbalah with a K,
Right.
the Jewish, and Kremertz it's follow on the Egyptian Greco. We talked about the four Hermetic bodies, talked about Pythagoreanism, we talked about the Renaissance writers and schools. So those who are interested in that lineage, or that wisdom branch, would feel at home with Kremertz. And plus those who are interested in applying these energetic techniques for themselves, for their family members, will see a practical outlet for it, other than just, for selfish reasons, or for, reasons of curiosity and so forth. So I think both at a theoretical and a practical aspect, that the Miriam, the Kremertz school of esoterism would have a very strong connection with getting greater popularity and awareness in North America and in the Western world in general.
Yeah, well, it seems like it would be very sympathetic to a lot of the ideas that are quite popular now. So, yeah, I would love to see that. So, I know that we're out of time. So, let me ask you two final, very quick questions. One is, what's coming up next for you? What are you working on now?
Okay, great. Thanks for asking that, Nick. I've got a couple of books. They're in manuscript format at this point. One's going to be published hopefully next year with Inner Traditions. It's called the Siren, or that's the working title. It's Explorations in Alchemical Hermeticism. That it's compilation. I'll have a number of works by Daffy, by myself as well, and explore some of the more, I guess, esoteric components of Hermeticism, things that we talked about here in terms of the Hermetic bodies, in terms of Eros as a medium for the application of some of these occult energies, of self-development and transcendence, looking at reincarnation and avataric components of self-development. So that working with this summer, and hopefully it'll see publication next year. Another book that a manuscript I'm working on. It's a provisional title, Hermetic Book of the Dead, which will focus on some of the aspects of elixirs to life, death, and rebirth and healing. So something that to look forward in the future as well. A number of other currents of thought that I'm looking to develop in the future, but haven't started to put pen to paper yet on. But still in this lineage that we're talking about now, that looks from this sort of Egyptian, Greco-Roman, Renaissance type of Hermeticism and its application in today's world.
Sounds fascinating. I'll look forward to reading them. And I know that there were a few of the themes that you just mentioned are in the current book that we didn't get to. So I'll look forward to digging in deeper when those are published. So the final question is, where can people go to find out more about you or to find you online?
You can write to the publisher Inner Traditions or contact me on social media. I do seminars, I do talks as well. If you have an interest in having a talk on Kremertz or on this tradition as well, or any aspects of the areas that I focus in terms of the spiritual and mystical traditions of the East and the West, then send me a note either on Facebook or Messenger, Instagram. Just want to reach out to me and be friends as well. That's cool as too. Like to be accessible, very much open to learning, to exchanging ideas with everyone, getting to know the audience, understanding what you like, or if you need further clarifications and aspects that you'd like me to explore further in explaining the significance, then by all means reach out to me and be glad to start a conversation.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, David, thank you so much for your time. I enjoyed the book and I really appreciate you exposing me and the world to Kremertz and this tradition that, I didn't know too much about. I know some of the, the other historical aspects, Bruno and all that.
Yeah.
But Kremertz was new to me. So I'm very grateful for you doing this work.
Great. Thanks a lot for inviting me, Nick. This was a great conversation. Enjoyed it.
Wonderful. Thank you. And that's a wrap on episode 94 of Rebel Spirit Radio. Thank you so much for listening or watching if you are part of my YouTube audience or view this on Spotify. If you like what I do here on Rebel Spirit Radio and would like to support my work, then please consider becoming a patron. You can find the link for the Patreon in the show notes or the video description. And of course, if you'd like to make a one-time donation, you can still do so via PayPal. I will be tremendously grateful for any support that you can provide. Another way that you can help the podcast is to share with friends, family members, even coworkers, anyone that you think will enjoy it, and share it on social media as well. That really is one of the best ways you can help and support the podcast. So one more time, if you feel moved by the Rebel Spirit, and I sure hope that you do, then please, by all means, help me share the good news. Also, if you enjoyed the podcast, please make sure to give it a positive rating on whatever platform you use to listen to or view podcasts. And please subscribe. For those viewing on YouTube, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you'll be informed when I upload new content. I'm Nick Mather, and you've been listening to or watching Rebel Spirit Radio. Until next time, may you be in peace, may you flourish in all possible ways, and may you continue to nurture your rebel spirit.